Snow lashed against the rotting timber of the Lockwood estate, burying the desperate sobs of a pregnant outcast. Banished, freezing, and hunted by her own kind, she thought this ruined house would be her tomb. Instead, she woke a dormant beast and uncovered a secret that rewrote history. The winter of 1432 was merciless, a sprawling expanse of white that swallowed the northern territories of the Callaway Dominion. Through the dense, unforgiving tree line of the whispering pines, Rowena Hastings dragged her boots through snow that reached her knees. She was a woman running on the fumes of sheer primal instinct. Her woolen cloak, once a vibrant crimson that denoted her standing within the pack, was now tattered and caked with ice, clinging to her shivering frame. But it was not the biting frost that drove her forward. It was the terrifying, rhythmic thrumming of her own heart and the precious, fragile life growing heavy within her womb. Rowena was an Omega, a designation that, in the brutal hierarchy of the medieval werewolf packs, condemned her to a life of servitude and submission. Yet, she had been uniquely favored, or so she had foolishly believed. She had been the chosen mate of Alistair Callaway, the ruthless alpha of the Western Ridges. For 3 years, she had warmed his bed and endured the sneers of the pack nobility, tolerated only because of her rare, calming scent and the unprecedented affection Alistair had shown her. But the brutal reality of their world dictated that an alpha required a strong, alpha-born heir, a feat widely considered impossible for an Omega to provide. When the healers confirmed her pregnancy, Rowena had wept with joy, believing her position was finally secure. Her happiness, however, was violently shattered on the eve of the winter solstice. The pack's highest seer, a blind elder named Gregory, had cast the rune stones upon the great oak table of the Callaway stronghold. The prophecy he delivered had sealed her fate. The child she carries bears the mark of the old kings. Gregory had rasped, his sightless eyes rolled back. It will not bow to the Callaway line. It will consume it. Alistair's affection had evaporated in the span of a single heartbeat. The alpha, who had whispered sweet promises into her ear, had looked at her swollen belly with unmasked revulsion and terror. He did not see a child. He saw a usurpation. By nightfall, the decree was made. Rowena was to be sacrificed to the winter spirits to cleanse the pack of the prophesied doom. She had barely escaped. A sympathetic servant, a crippled beta named Thomas, had unlocked her chamber doors and provided her with a meager satchel of dried meats and a hunting knife, urging her to run into the blizzard where the hounds could not immediately track her scent. Now, 3 days into her agonizing flight, Rowena's strength was failing. Every step was a monumental effort, a battle against the searing pain in her lower back and the numbing cold creeping up her limbs. Her breaths plumed in the freezing air, erratic and ragged. She clutched her swollen abdomen, whispering breathless reassurances to the restless life inside her. The child was kicking, a frantic, fluttering movement that felt like a desperate plea for survival. "Just a little further," Rowena murmured, her lips cracked and bleeding. "Hold on, little one. Just a little longer." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the snow in bruised hues of violet and deep blue, the trees finally began to part. Rowena stumbled, catching herself against the rough bark of an ancient elm. When she lifted her heavy gaze, she saw it. Rising from the snow-drowned earth like the skeletal remains of a fallen titan stood the Lockwood estate. It was a sprawling stone manor from a bygone era, long abandoned and left to rot. Its towering spires were partially collapsed, and the grand iron gates were rusted wide open, hanging lazily off their stone hinges. Great vines of ivy, dead and frozen, strangled the cracked masonry. Most of the stained glass windows were shattered, leaving dark, gaping holes that stared out into the wilderness like empty eye sockets. Local superstition claimed the grounds were cursed, haunted by the spirits of a pack that had been slaughtered a century prior. To Rowena, it looked like salvation. Summoning the absolute last reserves of her waning energy, she pushed herself away from the tree and staggered across the courtyard. The snow here was undisturbed, a pristine blanket that confirmed no one had walked these grounds in a very long time. She reached the massive double doors of the main entrance. The wood was warped and splintered. She leaned her shoulder against the heavy oak, pushing with all her might. With a protesting, metallic screech that echoed eerily across the empty courtyard, the door gave way, and Rowena tumbled forward into the dark, cavernous foyer. The interior was colder than the outside, trapped in a perpetual damp chill. Dust motes danced in the pale moonlight that filtered through the ruined ceiling. The remnants of past grandeur, shredded tapestries, overturned mahogany tables, and a massive, soot-stained stone hearth loomed in the shadows. Rowena dragged herself toward the hearth. Her body was shutting down, the adrenaline that had fueled her escape finally receding, leaving behind a crushing wave of exhaustion. She collapsed onto the cold flagstones, pulling her tattered cloak tightly around herself and her unborn child. She lacked the strength to search for firewood, lacking the strength to even keep her eyes open. As the darkness claimed her, her last conscious thought was a silent prayer that the winter would take her gently and that Alistair would never find her body. Warmth. It was a sensation Rowena had firmly believed she would never experience again. It started as a faint prickling in her numb fingertips and toes, slowly blooming into a radiant, comforting heat that chased away the bone-deep ache of the frost. Her eyelids fluttered, heavy and crusted with dried tears. The scent hit her before her vision fully cleared a rich, overwhelming aroma of burning pine, roasted meat, and underneath it all, the sharp, undeniable scent of ozone, rain, and raw, untamed alpha dominance. Rowena gasped, her eyes snapping open. She scrambled backward, her back slamming against the stone structure of the hearth. She was no longer lying on the freezing flagstones. She was resting on a thick, luxurious pile of bear and wolf pelts. A roaring fire was blazing in the massive fireplace, illuminating the previously dark hall with a flickering golden glow. Suspended over the flames, a haunch of venison roasted on a spit, the fat dripping and hissing into the fire. She was not alone. Sitting on a massive, intricately carved wooden chair dragged close to the fire was a man. He was enormous, possessing the broad, heavy-set shoulders of a warrior bred for slaughter. He wore a simple, rough-spun tunic and dark leather breeches, both heavily worn but well-maintained. His dark hair was wild, hanging past his shoulders and framing a face that was both terrifying and strikingly handsome. A thick, jagged scar carved its way down the left side of his face, crossing over a ruined, milky white eye. His good eye, however, was a piercing, luminous amber, the unmistakable mark of a fully shifted werewolf. He was watching her. He had been watching her sleep. Rowena's hand instinctively flew to her swollen belly, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She was an Omega, cornered in an abandoned ruin by a strange, scarred alpha. In their brutal society, an alpha without a pack was a rogue, a creature driven entirely by base instincts and violence. "You snore," the man said. His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone, sounding like stones grinding against each other. It was a voice out of practice, a voice that hadn't spoken to another living soul in years. Rowena swallowed hard, trying to project a bravery she did not feel. Who are you? What is this place?" The man didn't move. He continued to carve a piece of wood with a hunting knife, his large, calloused hands moving with surprising dexterity. "You broke into my house, little Omega. I believe I am the one entitled to ask the questions." "This is the Lockwood estate," Rowena countered, her voice trembling slightly. "It belongs to no one. It has been abandoned for decades." The man finally stopped carving. He looked up, his one good eye pinning her in place with the intensity of a physical weight. It belonged to the Lockwoods. Now, it belongs to the ghosts. And to me, he stabbed the knife into the armrest of his chair. "I am Gideon. And you are a very long way from whatever warm bed you were thrown out of." Gideon. The name didn't spark any immediate recognition, but his scent, so powerful, so distinctly authoritative, suggested he was no mere rogue. He smelled of old blood and ancient earth, a scent that commanded immediate submission from her Omega instincts. She fought the urge to bare her neck, forcing herself to maintain eye contact. "I am Rowena," she said, her chin lifting defiantly. I was of the Calloway pack." Gideon scoffed, a harsh, mirthless sound. Calloway. A pack of preening peacocks and backstabbing politicians. Alistair Calloway wouldn't know true alpha leadership if it bit him in his polished boots. What is one of his precious, coddled Omegas doing freezing to death in my ruins? Rowena's breath hitched at the mention of Alistair's name. The trauma of the past few days threatened to bubble over, but she forced it down. "That is my business. If you intend to kill me, do it quickly. If not, let me rest, and I will be gone by sunrise." Gideon leaned forward, the firelight casting demonic shadows across his scarred visage. He inhaled deeply, his nostrils flaring as he tasted the air. Rowena tensed, knowing exactly what he was scenting. "You smell of fear," Gideon murmured, his tone softening slightly, losing a fraction of its jagged edge. "You smell of exhaustion. But mostly, you smell of milk and new life." His gaze dropped to her rounded stomach, hidden beneath her ragged garments. "You are with child. Far along, too." "7th month?" "8th," Rowena corrected defensively, wrapping her arms protectively around herself. Gideon sat back, a complex array of emotions passing over his rugged face. In the medieval werewolf law, pregnant females were considered sacred, regardless of rank. To harm one, or to allow one to come to harm, was an affront to the moon goddess herself. Even rogues adhered to this deeply ingrained instinct. "Calloway threw out a heavily pregnant Omega?" Gideon asked, genuine disbelief coloring his rough voice. "Even for that arrogant bastard, that is low. Why?" Rowena hesitated. If she told him the truth that the child was prophesied to destroy an entire lineage, he might see her as a threat. But looking into his solitary amber eye, she saw a weariness that mirrored her own. He was a man who had been broken by the world, much like she had. "A seer," Rowena whispered, the admission tasting like ash in her mouth. "A seer claimed my child would bring ruin to the Calloway line. Alistair decided he would rather sacrifice his own flesh and blood than risk his throne." Silence stretched between them, save for the crackling of the fire. Gideon stared at the flames for a long time. The tension in the grand hall was thick enough to cut with a blade. Finally, he reached over, unhooked the spit from the fire, and expertly carved a thick slice of the roasted venison. He tossed it onto a wooden trencher and slid it across the floor toward her. "Eat," Gideon commanded softly. Rowena stared at the meat, her stomach giving a violent, painful lurch of hunger. I have nothing to give you in return." "I didn't ask for payment," Gideon grunted, picking up his carving wood again. "The blizzard outside is getting worse. You will stay here until the storm breaks. You will eat, you will rest, and you will stay out of my way." It wasn't an invitation, it was an alpha's order. But for the first time in weeks, Rowena felt a tiny spark of hope. She crawled forward, pulling the trencher onto her lap, and took her first bite of warm food in days. As she ate, she watched the scarred giant in the shadows. He was terrifying, he was gruff, and he was a stranger. But as the wind howled violently against the stone walls of the ruined manor, Rowena realized that this fearsome beast of a man was the only thing standing between her and certain death. A fortnight passed in a blur of howling winds and snow-blind days. The blizzard that trapped them within the decaying walls of the Lockwood estate proved to be historically severe, burying the medieval world in a suffocating layer of ice. Inside the grand hall, however, a strange, fragile domesticity had taken root. Gideon Fenwick Rowena had eventually coaxed. His full name from him was a man of profound contradictions. He looked like a barbarian warlord, yet he possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of herbalism and medieval medicine. When the bitter cold caused the joints in Rowena's lower back to seize with agonizing pain, Gideon had vanished into the bowels of the estate, returning with a poultice made of crushed willow bark, wintergreen, and melted bear fat. He had ordered her to apply it, turning his back respectfully while she did. The relief had been instantaneous. They did not speak much during those first few days. Gideon spent hours maintaining the fire, repairing broken hunting traps, or simply sitting in his massive chair, staring into the flames with a haunted expression. Rowena busied herself by mending his tattered tunics, using a bone needle and sinew thread she found in an old chest, a silent offering of gratitude for his protection. Slowly, the icy barrier between them began to thaw. One evening, as the storm outside finally began to quiet, leaving behind an eerie, muffled silence, Rowena sat by the hearth, struggling to card a mat of tangled wool she had found. Gideon watched her from his chair, a cup of warmed, spiced wine in his hand. "You possess the patience of a saint, Omega," Gideon rumbled, breaking the silence. "Or perhaps you are just painfully stubborn." Rowena paused, brushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead. When one's life consists of being told what to do and when to do it, one learns to find solace in the small, repetitive tasks. "It is not patience, Gideon, it is survival." Gideon's amber eye locked onto hers, burning with an intense, unreadable emotion. Survival, he echoed bitterly. A concept I am intimately familiar with. You are Gideon Fenwick, Rowena said softly, voicing the realization she had come to days ago. You were the alpha of the Eastern Valleys. The histories say your pack was wiped out by a rival faction 10 years ago. They said you died with them. Gideon's hand tightened around his cup, his knuckles turning white. The scarred ruin of his face seemed to contort in the flickering firelight. History is written by the victors, Rowena, and the victors were a coalition led by Alistair Calloway's father. They did not just wipe out my pack, they slaughtered them in their sleep. Men, women, pups. They left me for dead, blinded and broken, to ensure the Fenwick line ended. Rowena gasped, a hand flying to her mouth. The Calloways had built their empire on alliances and supposed honor. To hear of such treachery made her stomach churn. I had no idea. I am so sorry. Do not pity me, Gideon growled, though there was no real heat in his voice, only a profound, exhausted sorrow. I have spent a decade in these ruins, letting the ghost of my past consume me. I swore I would never involve myself in the politics of the Pax again. I swore I would die in this forgotten house. He stood up suddenly, pacing toward her. The sheer size of him in the enclosed space was overwhelming, yet Rowena felt no fear. He knelt beside her, his massive frame dwarfing hers. But then you crawled through my door, Gideon murmured, his gaze dropping to her stomach. And you brought a storm with you. He leaned in closer. Over the past 2 weeks, Gideon had been acutely aware of her scent. It was not just the sweet, soothing scent of an omega, nor just the milky scent of pregnancy. There was something else beneath it, something ancient. May I? He asked, his deep voice barely above a whisper, gesturing to her abdomen. Rowena hesitated, then nodded slowly. Gideon reached out, his massive, scarred hand remarkably gentle as he placed it over the swell of her belly. Immediately, the child kicked violently against his palm. Gideon's eye widened. He closed his eye, breathing in deeply, letting his alpha senses bypass the superficial layers of scent. He inhaled the essence of the life growing inside her. Suddenly, Gideon ripped his hand away, stumbling back a step as if he had been burned. His amber eye was wide with shock. By the goddess, he breathed, staring at her as if seeing her for the first time. The seer, Gregory. He wasn't lying. What? Rowena asked, panic flaring in her chest. What is it? Is the child deformed? Is it— No, Gideon interrupted, his voice shaking with a mixture of awe and terror. Rowena, who were your parents? I don't know, she stammered, confused. I was an orphan, found on the borders of the Hastings pack. They took me in as a servant. Why does it matter? Because, Gideon said, his chest heaving, that child does not carry the scent of the Calloway lineage. The alpha blood in that child is dormant, ancient. It smells of silver and earth. It smells of the original kings of the north. The royal lineage. Rowena stared at him, the world spinning. The royal lineage had been extinct for 3 centuries. They were the legendary rulers who united the werewolf factions before the Great Schism. You carry the blood of the true kings, Rowena, Gideon said, his voice grave. Alistair didn't want you dead because the child would destroy his line. He wanted you dead because your child has a legitimate, divine right to rule every pack on this continent. Your child is the true sovereign. The revelation crashed over her like a physical blow. She wasn't just an omega tossed aside. She was the vessel of a king. Before Rowena could process the magnitude of his words, a sound shattered the heavy silence of the manor. It was faint at first, carried on the chilling wind that swept through the broken windows, but to the highly attuned ears of a werewolf, it was unmistakable. Ah, whoa, whoa, whoa. The deep, guttural howl of a tracking hound. Gideon's head snapped toward the great wooden doors, his demeanor instantly transforming from a shocked observer to a deadly predator. The muscles in his back coiled, and a low, terrifying snarl ripped from his throat. His amber eye began to glow in the darkness. They found you, Gideon growled. Rowena scrambled to her feet, clutching her belly, her heart hammering frantically. Alistair's men. Worse, Gideon said, marching toward a heavy oak chest near the wall and throwing it open. He pulled out a massive, gleaming broadsword, the steel catching the firelight. That is the call of the bloodhounds. Alistair sent Beatrice. Beatrice. The name sent a jolt of pure ice through Rowena's veins. Beatrice Montgomery was Alistair's lead tracker, a sadistic female alpha known for skinning her bounties alive. If Beatrice was here, it meant there was no reasoning, no escape. It meant a slaughter. Another howl echoed, this time much closer. The crunch of snow beneath dozens of heavy boots resonated from the courtyard outside. The storm had broken, and the hunters had arrived. Gideon turned to Rowena, the scarred beast of Fenwick Manor fully unleashed. Get to the cellar, Rowena. Barricade the iron door. Do not come out no matter what you hear. Gideon! They will kill you! Rowena cried, tears springing to her eyes. Gideon swung the broadsword, testing its weight, a grim, terrifying smile spreading across his ruined face. Let them try, my queen. I have owed the Callaways a debt for 10 years. Tonight, I collect. A massive crash echoed through the grand hall as a battering ram struck the heavy oak doors. The wood splintered. The boundary of the Lockwood estate had been breached. The hunt had begun. The colossal oak doors of the Lockwood estate did not simply break. They exploded inward under the sheer, brute force of the battering ram. Splinters of ancient wood the size of javelins rained down upon the stone floor of the foyer, accompanied by a blast of freezing wind that threatened to extinguish the roaring hearth. From the swirling vortex of snow and shadows emerged Beatrice Montgomery. She was a towering, sinewy woman clad in boiled leather and chainmail, her face painted with the dried blood of her previous hunts. Flanking her were a dozen of Alistair Calloway's most elite enforcers, heavily armed and flanked by massive, snarling mastiffs whose eyes gleamed with unnatural malice. Among them stood Captain Reginald Croft, a notorious mercenary whose loyalty was bought with silver and blood. According to the recently recovered private journals of Arthur Pendleton, a 15th-century historian whose secret archives in Yorkshire first brought this hidden supernatural war to light, Croft was known to have slaughtered entire villages just to mask the scent of his pack's movements. Beatrice stepped over the ruined threshold, her boots crunching on the debris. She inhaled deeply, a cruel, jagged smile stretching across her face. I smell the coward, Beatrice sneered, her voice echoing through the cavernous hall. And the scent of milk. The Omega is here. Flush her out, tear her apart, and bring me the unborn whelp's heart in a silver box. Lord Calloway demands it. Before her men could take a single step, a massive shadow detached itself from the gloom near the hearth. Gideon Fenwick stepped into the moonlight, filtering through the collapsed roof. He held the great broadsword casually in one hand, the firelight dancing along its lethal edge. He did not look like a broken hermit. He looked like a god of war awakened from a centuries-long slumber. Beatrice halted, her cruel smile faltering as her eyes adjusted to the scarred, towering figure blocking the hallway that led to the cellars. She squinted, her nostrils flaring as she caught his scent, a scent that had supposedly been eradicated from the earth 10 years prior. It cannot be, Reginald Croft whispered, taking an involuntary step back, his hand trembling on the hilt of his axe. The Eastern Alpha is dead. Not dead, Croft, Gideon rumbled, his voice a slow, terrifying crawl of gravel and impending violence. Merely waiting for the day the Calloway scum would finally march to my doorstep so I wouldn't have to hunt you down one by one. Beatrice recovered her composure, baring her elongated canines. Gideon Fenwick, the ghost of a slaughtered pack. You are one blind, crippled man against an army. Step aside, and I might let you keep your remaining eye. I am the master of this house, Gideon roared, the sheer force of his alpha command shaking the dust from the rafters. And you have tracked mud onto my floors? With blinding speed that defied his massive size, Gideon lunged. He didn't shift into his wolf form. The enclosed space of the manor favored the reach and devastation of cold steel. His broadsword cleaved through the air, finding the neck of the nearest enforcer before the man could even raise his shield. Blood sprayed across the ancient tapestries in a macabre arc. The grand hall erupted into absolute chaos. Down in the suffocating darkness of the cellar, Rowena pressed her back against the cold, damp stone wall, her hands clamped tightly over her mouth to muffle her terrified sobs. She had dragged heavy oak barrels and rusted iron chains in front of the reinforced cellar door, barricading herself in as Gideon had commanded. Above her, the ceiling shuddered with the concussive force of the battle. She could hear the sickening crunch of bone, the agonized shrieks of dying men, and the terrifying guttural roars of Gideon as he held the line. Every crash of steel against steel sent a fresh wave of terror coursing through her veins. Then, a different kind of pain seized her. It started as a dull, agonizing tightening in her lower abdomen, entirely distinct from the ache of her journey. The stress, the sheer terror, and the physical exertion of moving the barricades had triggered the inevitable. A warm gush of fluid soaked through her woolen dress, pooling onto the dirt floor. Rowena gasped, her eyes widening in the pitch-black cellar. "No," she whimpered, clutching her swollen belly. "Not now. Goddess, please, not now." But the child within her, the prophesied sovereign of the Northern Territories, would not wait. A horrific contraction ripped through her body, forcing a strangled scream from her lips. She collapsed onto her side, digging her fingernails into the hard-packed dirt. She was completely alone, in the dark, with a pack of murderers trying to break through the floorboards above. Upstairs, the grand hall was painted in carnage. Gideon fought like a demon possessed. He used the geography of the ruined estate to his advantage, forcing Beatrice's men into a narrow choke point between the fallen pillars. He deflected an axe strike from Reginald Croft, stepping inside the mercenary's guard and driving the pommel of his sword into Croft's face, shattering his jaw and sending him sprawling into the fireplace. But Gideon was only one man. A spear, thrust from the shadows by a cowardly enforcer, caught him in the side, biting deep into his ribs. Gideon grunted, snapping the wooden shaft with his bare hand and backhanding the attacker with enough force to break his neck. Beatrice saw her opening. As Gideon stumbled, clutching his bleeding side, she drew a pair of serrated hunting knives and vaulted over a fallen table, lunging for his throat. "For Calloway!" she shrieked. Gideon twisted, catching one of her wrists, but the other knife plunged into his shoulder. Pain exploded through his body, blinding and white-hot. Beatrice grinned maliciously, her face mere inches from his. "Alistair sends his regards, Fenwick," she spat. "He sold your pack's location to the French warlord Henri de Lafayette 10 years ago to secure the western trade routes. Your family died for silver coins. And now, you will die for nothing." The revelation struck Gideon harder than the blade in his shoulder. The Calloways hadn't just been rivals, they had been traitors to their own kind, selling northern sovereign soil to foreign enemies. A dark, fathomless rage ignited within Gideon's chest. His amber eye flared with a terrifying incandescent light. The human guise melted away, his muscles expanding, his jaw elongating as the beast within completely took over. With a roar that shattered the remaining stained glass windows, Gideon tore the knife from his shoulder, ignoring the spray of his own blood. He grabbed Beatrice by the throat, lifting her off the ground with one hand. "I am not dying tonight," Gideon snarled, his voice distorted and monstrous. With a sickening crack that silenced the remaining enforcers, he snapped the Alpha Tracker's neck and tossed her lifeless body into the snow. The remaining 6 enforcers froze, staring in abject horror at the mangled corpse of their leader. Gideon stood before them, bathed in blood, his chest heaving, looking less like a werewolf and more like a mythological god of vengeance. "Burn it!" Reginald Croft mumbled through his shattered jaw, crawling away from the hearth and grabbing a burning log. "Burn the house down, trap them inside." Gideon knew he could not stop them all from throwing fire, and his body was failing. The spear wound in his side was bleeding heavily, his vision swimming with dark spots. He turned and threw his massive weight against the secret lever hidden in the stonework. The heavy iron grate that protected the cellar stairs slammed shut, locking from the inside. He stumbled down the spiraling stone steps, leaving the remaining mercenaries to set their futile fires above. When Gideon reached the bottom of the cellar, the air was thick with the copper scent of blood and the undeniable sweet musk of impending birth. "Rowena," he called out, his voice weak and ragged. "Gideon!" Her voice was a fragile, high-pitched wail from the darkness. He fumbled in the dark, finding a flint and a solitary tallow candle left on a barrel. He struck the flint, the small flame illuminating the damp cellar. Rowena was lying on a bed of old, rotted canvas, her face pale as a ghost, soaked in sweat. Gideon dropped his sword and fell to his knees beside her. He pressed his large, bloody hand against her cheek. "I am here. The door is sealed. They cannot reach us." "The baby!" Rowena cried, arching her back as another brutal contraction tore through her. "It's coming." Gideon, it hurts so much. Look at me, Gideon commanded gently. His terrifying demeanor entirely vanished, replaced by the profound, instinctive care of a protector. You are Rowena. You survived the blizzard. You survived, Calloway. You will survive this. Push. Above them, the muffled sounds of shouting and the crackle of burning wood echoed through the floorboards. Smoke began to curl down the stone steps. Time was running out. I can't, Rowena sobbed, completely exhausted, her body violently shaking. I'm not strong enough. You carry the blood of the first kings, Gideon urged, gripping her hand firmly. You are stronger than the stone holding this house together. Breathe, for your child, Rowena. Push. With a guttural primal scream that drowned out the roaring fire above, Rowena gave one final earth-shattering push. Suddenly, the cellar fell eerily silent. The sound of Rowena's heavy, ragged breathing filled the damp air. Then, it happened. A sharp, piercing cry echoed in the darkness. It was a baby's wail, but there was an unnatural, vibrating resonance to it. As the newborn took its first breath of air, an invisible kinetic shockwave exploded outward from the cellar. It was not a physical force, but a spiritual one, a command encoded into the very DNA of their species, the sovereign aura. Upstairs, the enforcers who were preparing to hurl their torches into the stairwell suddenly froze. The smoke swirling around them seemed to stand still. Reginald Croft dropped his burning log. A terrifying, overwhelming weight slammed into their minds, dropping them instantly to their hands and knees. It was the biological imperative of the werewolf race. The true king had been born, and every wolf within a 5-mile radius felt the irresistible, crushing instinct to bare their necks in absolute submission. The hounds outside stopped their furious barking and whimpered, pressing their bellies into the snow. In the cellar, Gideon, despite his grievous wounds, felt the compulsion pulling at his spine. He slowly lowered his head, pressing his forehead against the damp dirt floor, submitting to the tiny, bloody infant crying in Rowena's arms. "A boy," Gideon whispered reverently, tears mixing with the blood on his ruined face. "My queen, you have a son." Rowena pulled the child to her chest, wrapping him in the clean, dry remnants of her cloak. The baby's cries subsided, replaced by a soft, content cooing. As Rowena looked down at him, she saw that his eyes were wide open. They were a striking, luminous silver, the undeniable mark of the ancient royal lineage. She looked up at Gideon, who was struggling to stay conscious, his blood pooling on the floor. "Gideon," she pleaded, reaching out her free hand to him. "Do not leave us. He needs a father. He needs a protector. I need you." Gideon looked at the woman who had brought light back into his dead world, and the child who would change the course of history. He reached out, his bloody fingers gently wrapping around hers. "I swear it," he breathed. "On my life. On my soul." The fire above miraculously burned out, smothered by the oppressive, suffocating weight of the newborn's aura. When the dawn finally broke, painting the snow-covered ruins of the Lockwood estate in hues of brilliant gold and pink, the world had fundamentally shifted. When Gideon, heavily bandaged and leaning on a makeshift crutch, finally kicked open the iron grate and helped Rowena up the stairs, they were met with a sight that would be etched into the secret historical annals of their kind forever. Reginald Croft and the remaining enforcers were kneeling in the ashes of the grand hall. They did not raise their weapons. They did not speak. As Rowena emerged, holding the silver-eyed child against her chest, the mercenaries lowered their heads until their foreheads touched the soot-stained floor. Alistair Calloway's reign of terror and political treachery ended not with a massive war, but with a single, resonant cry in a dark cellar. Within a month, the news of the sovereign's birth spread through the northern territories like wildfire. The Pax, disgusted by Alistair's treason with the French warlords and magnetically drawn to the true bloodline, rebelled. Alistair was overthrown, chained, and brought before the ruins of the Lockwood estate to face justice. Rowena Hastings, once a banished, pregnant Omega left to die in the snow, stood upon the reconstructed balcony of the estate. Beside her stood Gideon Fenwick, the resurrected Alpha, now the Lord Protector of the realm and her fiercely devoted mate, and in her arms rested the Sovereign, the silver-eyed boy who had united a fractured kingdom. They had sought to bury her in the winter, completely unaware that she was the seed that would bring forth the ultimate spring. Did the tale of Rowena's desperate survival, Gideon's brutal redemption, and the rebirth of the true king leave you breathless. The betrayal, the fierce medieval battles, and the ultimate twist of fate prove that even the most banished outcast can change history. If you loved this intense werewolf romance drama, please hit that like button. Share this incredible story with your friends. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, heart-pounding stories just like this one.